Altair Brennan's mansion loomed like a fortress on the outskirts of the city, a cold testament to his success. The sprawling estate boasted marble floors, shimmering chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless art. Yet, for all its grandeur, the house felt empty, echoing with silence more often than laughter. At 40 years old, Altair had everything most people dreamed of: a billion-dollar empire, respect in business circles, and a lifestyle of luxury. But beneath the polished surface lay a man deeply unsatisfied. His wealth had come at a cost, one he rarely allowed himself to consider. That morning, Altair stared out of his office window at the manicured gardens below, sipping a cup of bitter coffee. The sky was overcast, mirroring the unease that had settled in his chest. A sleepless night had left his thoughts in disarray. He couldn't shake the vivid dream he'd had, a haunting vision of Jameer Solon, a man he had fired years ago for no reason other than the color of his skin. In the dream, Jameer had stood in a barren field, his face streaked with tears. He spoke not with anger but with profound sadness. "You never saw me, Mr. Brennan. You saw what you wanted to see, a shadow, someone lesser. But I am more than that. We all are." The words lingered, a thorn in Altair's mind. He tried to dismiss them as the remnants of some guilty thought buried deep within him. After all, guilt was for the weak. Or so he'd told himself for decades. "Mr. Brennan," his assistant's voice interrupted over the intercom. It was Daylise, a young woman who handled his schedule with the precision of a surgeon. "Yes," he snapped, more curtly than he intended. "There's a charity gala this evening. Shall I confirm your attendance?" Altair sighed. Another night of handshakes and shallow conversations. But before he could answer, he stopped himself. What kind of charity was it? Would it be another organization that he conveniently ignored if it didn't align with his polished image? "No," he said finally. "Cancel everything for today. I need time to think." Daylise didn't press further, though her hesitation was palpable. 4 hours, Altair roamed his house, restless. He tried distractions: a cigar on the patio, a swim in his heated pool, even flipping through the pages of a book he'd never bothered to read. Nothing worked. The image of Jameer persisted, his sorrowful voice reverberating like a church bell. As night fell, Altair found himself standing at the door of his personal chapel, a small, rarely used room tucked away on the west wing of the mansion. It was a decorative space, more for appearances than faith. Altair wasn't a religious man. He'd long dismissed the notion of a higher power. Yet tonight, something drove him to enter. He sat on the hard wooden bench, his head bowed, as though expecting some revelation. Instead, the silence wrapped around him like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. "Why now?" he whispered to himself. "Why do I care after all these years?" The room offered no answers, only the flicker of a solitary candle on the altar. In the stillness, a memory surfaced, a younger version of himself, standing at a factory floor, berating a black worker who had dared to question his decision. "People like you don't get to question people like me," he had said. The man's name had been Tobias, and his face too now joined the procession in Altair's mind. Something cracked inside him. It wasn't regret, not yet, but an awareness of the weight he carried. The next morning, Altair made a decision that felt both foreign and inevitable. He left his mansion and drove aimlessly through the city, finding himself in a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. It was a part of town he used to avoid, vibrant, diverse, and alive in ways his pristine world was not. St. Solace Church came into view like a beacon. The unassuming brick building sat humbly at the corner of the street, its doors open, welcoming all. Altair parked his car and stared at the entrance for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he stepped out, his expensive loafers hitting the cracked pavement. The bell rang as he walked up the stone steps. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. What was he doing here? But something, perhaps the faint echo of Jameer's voice, or the weight of his own heart, pushed him forward. Altair opened the door and stepped inside. The faint scent of incense greeted him, along with the murmurs of hymns sung softly by a small choir. At the far end of the aisle stood Father Emetrius Agatho, his robes flowing as he lit candles on the altar. Altair took a deep breath and walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. For the first time in decades, he felt unsure of himself. "Father," he said, his voice unsteady, "I need to confess." Father Emetrius turned slowly, his calm gaze settling on Altair. The priest was a man of gentle presence, with silver streaks in his thick, dark hair and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice steady but warm. "What is it you seek, my son?" Altair hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the cufflink of his tailored shirt. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted. Father Emetrius motioned toward a pew near the front of the church. "Then sit. Begin where your heart feels the heaviest." Altair moved stiffly, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. The faint creak of the wooden pew beneath him was the only sound for a moment. He looked up at the stained-glass windows, their colors casting fragmented light onto the floor. The images of saints and angels stared down at him, their serene expressions in stark contrast to the storm inside him. "I've done things," Altair began, his voice low. "Things I'm not proud of. Things that," he paused, swallowing hard, "that have hurt people." Father Emetrius nodded silently, encouraging him to continue. Altair's fingers gripped the edge of the pew. "When I started my company, I thought I was building something great. I thought I deserved every ounce of success. But somewhere along the way, He stopped, his voice catching. "I became someone else. Someone cold." "Cold to whom?" Father Emetrius asked gently. "To the people I thought didn't matter," Altair admitted. The words felt like shards of glass in his throat. I dismissed black men and women who worked for me, treated them like they were beneath me. I refused to promote them, ignored their ideas. And I fired them, sometimes for no reason at all. I told myself it was business, but it wasn't. It was something uglier." Father Emetrius remained still, his hands resting calmly on his lap. "Do you know why you did these things?" Altair laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Because I was raised to think that way. Because I believed the lies I grew up with. And because I was too arrogant to question them." He looked down at his hands. "But now I can't escape it. Every face, every name, they haunt me." "Guilt has a way of surfacing when we least expect it," Father Emetrius said. "But guilt alone doesn't bring change. It's what you do with it that matters." Altair leaned forward, his head in his hands. "How do I even begin to fix this? How do you undo years of harm?" The priest's voice was steady. "You can't undo what's been done. But you can atone. Have you sought forgiveness from those you've wronged?" Altair's head snapped up. "What if they don't forgive me?" "Then you must still try," Father Emetrius said firmly. "Seeking forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about acknowledging it and choosing to move forward differently. Forgiveness, when it comes, is a gift, not a guarantee." Altair sat in silence, the weight of the priest's words settling on him. Finally, he spoke. "There's one man I can't stop thinking about. Jameer Solon. I fired him years ago. He was one of the best workers I had, but his voice faltered. "I didn't like the way he challenged me. It made me uncomfortable. And instead of seeing his value, I saw his skin color. And I pushed him out." Father Emetrius nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps Jameer is where you begin." Later that day, Altair sat in his car outside a modest suburban house. It was a far cry from the neighborhoods he frequented, and he felt out of place in his sleek black sports car. He clutched a piece of paper with Jameer Solon's address, which he had obtained through a private investigator. For several minutes, he couldn't bring himself to leave the car. What was he supposed to say? That he was sorry? That he'd changed? Would Jameer even believe him? Finally, he took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and walked up the driveway. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel seemed deafening. He hesitated at the door, then knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door opened. Jameer stood there, older but still imposing, his posture straight and his expression unreadable. "Mr. Brennan?" Jameer's voice carried a mix of confusion and suspicion. Altair shifted uncomfortably. "Jameer. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "Oh, I remember you," Jameer said flatly, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Altair struggled to find the words. "I came to apologize. For what I did to you. For firing you. For everything." Jameer crossed his arms, his face guarded. "And what brought this on? Feeling guilty all of a sudden?" "Yes," Altair admitted. "But it's more than that. I know I was wrong, Jameer. I can't change what I did, but I want to make it right. Somehow." For a long moment, Jameer said nothing. Then he stepped aside, opening the door wider. "You'd better come in." Altair's heart pounded as he stepped inside. He didn't know what awaited him, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Inside Jameer's modest living room, Altair felt out of place. The walls were lined with family photos and shelves filled with books and knickknacks. The scent of home-cooked food lingered in the air, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury of Altair's mansion. Jameer gestured to a chair and sat across from Altair, his gaze unwavering. "So, you're here to apologize," Jameer said, folding his hands. "But what do you expect from me? Forgiveness? Closure? What's the endgame, Brennan?" Altair shook his head, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. "I don't expect anything, Jameer. I came because I need you to know I was wrong. I was a coward, hiding behind my privilege and excuses. And I hurt you, and so many others, in ways I can never undo. I've spent years pretending it didn't matter. But it does. You matter." Jameer's expression softened, but his skepticism remained. "Words are easy, Brennan. What makes you think this changes anything?" Altair leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Because I'm not here to erase my guilt. I'm here because I want to learn how to be better. Not just for myself, but for everyone I've wronged. If there's any way I can help you, whether that means making amends or supporting your work, I want to do it." Jameer regarded him silently for a moment before nodding. "You want to help? Fine. Let's see if you mean it." Over the next few months, Altair threw himself into supporting Jameer's community initiatives. He donated money, but more importantly, he gave his time. Jameer, who ran a non-profit focused on providing job training and mentorship for marginalized communities, invited Altair to witness the struggles firsthand. For the first time, Altair sat in rooms filled with people he had once dismissed. He heard their stories, their triumphs, their pain, and the obstacles they faced. Slowly, he began to see the world through their eyes. At first, his presence was met with suspicion. Many doubted his intentions, and Altair couldn't blame them. But as weeks turned into months, his sincerity began to shine through. He worked side by side with volunteers, attended every meeting, and spoke openly about his own mistakes. One day, after a particularly long meeting, Jameer pulled him aside. "You've come a long way," he said. "But the real change isn't in what you've done here. It's in what you'll do moving forward. This work isn't about redemption, Brennan. It's about responsibility." Altair nodded. "I understand that now." Chapter 5. A New Legacy. 2 years later, the community gathered for the grand opening of the Solonbrennan Community Center, a state-of-the-art facility offering free vocational training, childcare, and mentorship programs. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew hundreds of people, and for the first time in his life, Altair stood not as a man of wealth, but as a man of service. As he looked out at the diverse crowd, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Jameer stood beside him, his hand resting on the shoulder of a young mentee. When it was Altair's turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium. "This center is more than a building," he began, his voice steady. "It's a commitment to a better future. One where no one is dismissed or overlooked. I spent years perpetuating a system that hurt people like the ones in this room. And while I can never undo the harm I caused, I can dedicate the rest of my life to ensuring that no one else has to face it." The crowd erupted in applause, but Altair knew the real work was just beginning. Epilogue. Back at St. Solace Church, Altair knelt in quiet reflection. Father Emetrius approached, his expression serene. "You've come far, Altair," the priest said. Altair looked up, a faint smile on his face. "I finally understand what you meant. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to live differently every day." Father Emetrius nodded. "And are you at peace?" Altair hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. For the first time, I feel like I belong, not to my wealth or my power, but to something greater. To the people I've spent so long ignoring." The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. Then your journey has just begun. As Altair stepped out of the church into the bright morning sun, he felt lighter. The ghosts of his past still lingered, but they no longer haunted him. Instead, they guided him, reminding him of the path he had chosen, a path of responsibility, humility, and hope. The end.